And then, from the first, you guys aim to the States, correct?
We started back in Ukraine 2018, and in 1 year, a little bit in 1 year, we incorporated the United States.
So maybe many founders want to know, how did you get the first customer? Like grassroots activity. Hey, we have this service, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started from Upwork. We had to start from small projects, like, a couple $1,000s, step by step, and we were like building a lot of them in the future. So that's why we're betting heavily on BeforeCode.AI and launching publicly soon, because we're already using it internally, but launching public beta soon.
Okay, let's get started. Hi, Maksym. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm amazing. It's my, sadly to say, last day in Tokyo, but I have to fly back to US, but it's amazing. 9 days here. It was so great to explore the country, 2 cities, Tokyo and Kyoto, and even talk more to local startup founders and the startup community. So it was amazing.
So, actually, this is your birthday. Happy birthday, Maksym!
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's a very long birthday. It starts in Tokyo, and then it lasts during all my flight, and I'll meet it in US.
Yeah, so last Friday, I hosted a startup event in Tokyo, and Maksym came to the event, and then one of the main speakers was Ukrainian lady.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a big surprise for me, so it's really great to see that even Ukrainian community building startups here in Japan, and that Japan is open to support global immigrant founders. And this is really cool to know, and it's big area to explore for me as well.
Let's go to your story. So, Maksym, tell us about yourself. What do you do in the US?
So I'm running a company called WeSoftYou, and a couple other smaller products of our company right now. So WeSoftYou, the software development company, is outsourced software development company focused on building solutions in education, AI, healthcare, fintech, Web3, and with a lot of different types of solutions we're building in those industries. Right now, AI is a big thing, and it's completely transforming our industry. How do we approach working with those customers? So that's a big game changer, and we're working heavily right now.
So surprisingly, you are not come from engineer. So if I remember correctly, you are a CEO of the 80 engineers in your company, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you are come from a marketing and also kind of a project manager experience, and then you said accidentally you had to start your own company, right?
So there's a whole story around that. So and actually my product marketing experience helped me to structure the company in the way it's working now. So because I was not technical, I had a challenge how to really ensure smooth delivery and building projects in the right way for customers, so it has a highest quality. And to achieve that, I had to build up the process, pretty strict and sophisticated process. How do we approach managing our requirements, discovery of the product, how we structure everything in the software development lifecycle to ensure smooth delivery for our customers. And it helped me to deliver and manage complex projects while being non-technical, deliver them with a high quality. But then our CTO and my co-founder joined who is technical, and it's even enhanced our process. So we right now call this process 36 standards of quality, and we have every step of working with customer, working with requirements, how do you do reporting, how do you decompose tasks, how do you decompose projects into smaller pieces. We have our unique approach to that, how we do this. And now is approaching, call it danger of AI, but opportunities AI brings us to optimize things. Our process, we believe our process will be helpful even when AI will write the code completely, because to write a proper code is not about to write a good product, write a good program, it's not about writing a high quality code. It's about knowing what you're building. So if you want to achieve a great code from your engineer, right? So you need to explain, or you need to explain him what to build, or an engineer has to understand himself what he's building, because the plan of what you're building really affects the quality. And the same is AI. So if you imagine AI is your engineer, you need to know how to properly communicate with this AI to ensure the right product build. So that is like our process in our company, about ensuring we're building the right thing and giving it to engineers in the best way possible. We created even this special product. It's called BeforeCode.AI. So
BeforeCode.AI.
BeforeCode.AI. So where we actually work with requirements, where we integrate with Figma screens, augment those Figma screens with requirements automatically with the help of AI, and structuring it to decomposing it to tasks to developers right away automatically. So because I believe that's the future of software development, like powered by AI, is not just writing code, is to understand what to write and communicate with AI, how to properly build things. I think that's the key in AI-empowered software development in the future.
I see. I have tons of questions. So, basically, first, you said you have a co-founder and he is a CTO.
Yeah.
How did you meet him?
That's a whole story. So we met before my company. I had only one job, so I built up the career in the international company for like many years, and after that I left. I quit. I joined one startup which was already out of their funding, out of money. I'd worked there maybe for a couple of weeks, and then I would call it like accidentally founded WeSoftYou. So, and we met with Andrew at that startup, and in a couple of months, like maybe even a year later, we started to work together in WeSoftYou, and still working together happily and successfully.
Amazing. And then, if I remember correctly, you guys started establish a company together, and then from the first, you guys aim to the States, correct?
So yeah, we started back in Ukraine 2018, and in 1 year, a little bit in 1 year, we incorporated the United States. So because we had a complete focus on the United States, working with American founders, working with the American startup ecosystem, and yeah, so our focus was like primarily US. So now I live in US, and it's more closer to our customers.
So maybe many founders want to know, how did you get the first customer, second customer from the States? People's recommendation, or did you do kind of like grassroots activity? Hey, we have this service, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started from Upwork.
Upwork.
Yeah. It's a marketplace for all of our customers looking for freelancers or agencies, and so we were not that lucky to find like our dream customer or big customer who is with whom we grew together. We didn't have that fortune. We had to start from small projects, like a couple $1,000, step by step, and we were like building a lot of them, but because we had that process of managing customers, our unique approach to managing projects, it really helped us to deliver a lot of projects at the same time, grow the team quicker. But responding to your question is Upwork. Upwork and a couple, and then referrals. People were, when people know you doing business, doing software development services, people need this kind of services, and they, know you exist, and refer you, or they come back to you.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, your company's strength is one, like kind of quick, agile, and second, what can I say, knowing to what we have to build, we have to achieve, we have to make. Kind of, what can I say, shape of the business. But sometimes even clients, they don't know what are we making. Sometimes,
Yeah.
especially big company, how do you manage or it's difficult?
Yeah, so that's a big thing. That's main I would say main secret sauce of our company. That's we really working well with discovery stages, like when we work with customers to co-create, to understand what they need to build, and we're trying to keep the process flexible for them throughout. I mean, all the process of delivery. So because it should be agile, it should be flexible, and then we have a process how to do it even with a fixed price. So we manage these requirements. We have them structured and decomposed into the smaller pieces, and we help the customer to play with it on the go. So you can change things, you can move things, you see how it affects your total budget, total timeline. We set up the priorities, and we're trying to be as agile as possible to get the same vibe like in a startup as much as possible.
I see. So you must learn a lot of product management skill. So, if it's difficult, if we have big team, including our client, sometimes we tend to forget what's the newest information, or even client, they tend to forget what we decided today. So, do you do documentation a lot?
Oh yeah, that's a part of our 36 standards of quality. So it's a lot of documentation, and reports and release notes, everything. We keep pretty strict documentation and everything. So it helps a lot, and it removes all uncertainties. And sometimes customer can say, oh, I didn't want that. We say, I actually wanted, that was recorded. Not to say customer is bad or something, but just where people will sometimes forget something. I'm the same. I can come to my employees and say, hey guys, I didn't tell that, I didn't ask you to do that, and they say, no, you actually asked us to do so. So that's okay. It's just normal human being, and we build up the process in a way we know those vulnerabilities that could happen with the customers. So we try to make the process of development as less stressful, remove all the stress possible from that process.
Okay, last question. So, tell us about your 2025 milestone. Of course, I really hope.
Yeah, so we all hope the war is about to be finished soon. Hope with the best conditions for Ukraine, of course. And the plan is 2025. It looks like going hard on AI. So with our BeforeCode.AI solution, really succeed in AI-empowered software development. So then we want to grow more in the edtech space. We work with a couple really cool edtech projects right now with American schools, managing a lot of students' data all over the United States. So we want to work more heavily in the edtech space. And the third thing is a plan. We want to rebrand and separate our staffing services for startups. When we don't do the project, we just give engineers, because startups they really often need just engineers, and we build up currently a specific special offering for them, focused mainly on what startup needs: good engineers, options friendly, so we welcome you, give them options, easy to buy out engineers, after some period of time you can easily bring them, and easy replacements, management, culture adopting. So the focus completely on satisfying the need of startup when they want to hire outsource engineers. Remove all the blocks.
You have a strong strategy. It's great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's strategy for a couple of years, but we have milestones for each quarter and for every year. So working hard on that.
I see. Thank you so much. And your Uber is coming soon. You have to go to Haneda Airport.
Yeah. So I wish it could be 30 minutes longer interview, because it's so great to talk to you always. But since it's my birthday, I was meeting my birthday yesterday. Let's talk more about how AI is adopted in Japan.
I see. Good question. So, okay. So for the startup founder's perspective, and also the investor's perspective, typical Japanese companies, they don't make super unique software. They often make AI software to a kind of similar, almost a productive tool, because of safe. How about in your customers?
Yep. So I think like actually really using AI for building software right now is a big question around IP, like, and it's I believe there are already a lot of options for that, how to approach IP rights and everything. But when you use open source models, but it's still it's still not something popular and still kind of risky. So we need to see more adoption from bigger giants like tech giants, and then we will probably see smaller companies are okay with that. We need to see more cases when VCs are ready to invest in later stages or startups where the code is built by AI. So, and because sometimes startups also evaluated like the size of the team, right? Each engineer adds to startup valuation. That's why we need more practice to see more like kind of pioneers who will adopt this. For instance, like Meta, they say they wanna switch like all their middle level engineers to replace them with AI, and we need to see more of this coming, and then we will have more clarity how the future will look like. But what I'm completely 100% sure that the way how we communicate with AI, tools for communicating with AI, this is the key, and this is the future. So that's why we're betting heavily on BeforeCode.AI and launching publicly soon, because we're already using it internally, but launching public beta soon.
Interesting. Okay, so I forgot the software name.
BeforeCode.AI.
Cool. Okay, yeah. So you have two companies, current company and also its new product company.
Yeah.
Ooh, amazing.
Yeah, so it's really difficult to build the product when you're a service company, because it's actually two separate businesses, two different businesses, and you need to. I don't have time, for instance, right, to build that product as a startup, because a lot of my energy goes to building main business. That's why we're now looking for founding product managers, and we want to build up that product like a venture studio style, because we understand that we need a team who will build and work on that. So we're not able to fulfill that gap. But
okay, so if you want to join his team Maksym, please reach out to his LinkedIn.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you very much. Your podcast is amazing. A lot of great people, and thank you very much for your active position in the startup ecosystem here and in US. So looking forward to go to your events more often.
Yeah,
thank you.
Of course. Okay, bye. Perfect. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Maksym. 1. From service to AI product builder. Maksym didn't stop at running a successful tech staffing and software development company. He identified a market gap and built BeforeCode.AI, an internal AI-powered tool that streamlines the product discovery process before any code is written. This shows his shift from agency work to scalable product innovation. 2. Process-driven approach to high-quality software. Without engineering background, Maksym developed a rigorous delivery framework known as the 36 Standard of Quality. This structured approach helped him manage large engineering teams and complex software projects with clarity, speed, and flexibility, making him stand out in a competitive industry. 3. Global mindset with deep US market focus. Starting in Ukraine and scaling into the US market early on, Maksym always aimed to work closely with American startups. From humble beginning on Upwork to running multiple AI products and staffing service, his journey reflects the power of global ambition, adaptability, and founder-led resilience. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。